Welcome everybody, this is Rafa once again with Mystic Times. I'm happy that you're there. Today I have the great pleasure to be joined by Ken Goudsward. We're going to be talking a little bit about the UFO subject. Ken's got a pretty cool book that, that kind of compiles different encounters that he's found in the Bible in particular. So we're going to dive into that subject today and maybe whatever else comes up naturally. How are you, Ken?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on the show. It's a real privilege to be here. I'm looking forward to this discussion for sure.
Well, thank you. I'm also very honored to have you on. You reached out, and yeah, for me that was the first time somebody's reached out to be on the show. So it was kind of a marker for me in the evolution of this show that I'm doing. And I've been exploring many different subjects with people, but just the name kind of gives it away. So yeah, they're always related to mysticism, a little bit, I guess, also to time. But in particular, I call the show Mystic Times because of how this sense that I had in around like 2017, 2018, and I took some time to start the show indeed, but this sense that we're entering a kind of, or we've been entering a particular region of human evolution or of time, something like that, in which the more mystic or occult side, astrology, tarot, meditation, yoga, different healing modalities and spirituality in general, it's all been kind of ramping up. And I think your book kind of adds a little bit to that.
Yeah, I think so too. And I agree with you. You're right. And I'm not one of these I'm not really somebody who jumps on the Age of Aquarius bandwagon or whatever. But it's totally clear that something is happening, and whether that is written in the stars or not, there's something happening. So I think we'd be foolish to ignore that. And really what I think we're really seeing is kind of an opportunity, I guess, to question some of the things that we weren't allowed to question previously, or where you would have just been whether hand slapped or a lot worse. Certainly in other times of history, you could be endangering your life by saying things or asking questions even, right? And so I think for sure today there's a lot more openness in asking those questions, but that's not necessarily to say that it's all going to be smooth sailing as well. I've had some bumps along the road.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's still, even though it's more accepted, the UFO subject, and even talking about ancient traditions and their relationship with the UFO phenomenon, even though it's more open, I'm pretty sure there's still people that are very reluctant or afraid to touch that subject, or afraid of other people touching that subject, I guess.
Yeah. So I kind of got into this by I come from a pretty conservative Christian background, and one thing that I started doing was when I kind of started quite a long time ago, where I basically took a different approach to when I was reading my Bible. Instead of just reading a verse, I always made sure that I read the whole chapter to get the context that was happening there. And I think that's something that still a lot of people don't do. A lot of Christians are fine with just reading one verse, or not even reading it, but just listening to what somebody is telling them about it. And so there's a lot of misinformation and missing information that can really creep into our mindset. And so we end up thinking that if it's even just limiting to what does the Bible say as a question, we end up really limiting our understanding of what it says, because we've only read these tiny little pieces of it. and we kind of lose sight of the big picture. So several years ago, I started noticing that one thing that was lacking in my own model of who Jesus was is that he was not a preacher or a prophet at all, really. There's only 2 instances in the entire set of gospels where he preaches, and in both of those cases, there's the Sermon on the Mount and the feeding of the 5,000, and possibly one other case. And even there, he has a message, but he seems to have another agenda besides just telling people what's what. And most of the time, Jesus's agenda is one of healing and one of meeting people's needs physically, in terms of giving them food, giving them shelter, and giving them love. And he was very much a hands-on healing personality. And that's not really what the church presents. And that was what started getting me into, I guess, a little bit of debate with the authorities in terms of, well, how come we're not healing anybody? We come here and we talk and we talk and we talk, and nobody's getting healed. So something's not quite right. And so that was kind of what first got me started, is just noticing that there are these disparities between Christianity and the model that Jesus presented. So then after that, I was looking at, well, I actually set up a course, like a training course on how to do healing, because once I started practicing it, I actually was able to heal a few people, and I wanted to share that knowledge. And basically, so I set up a training course, and it didn't really catch on. Nobody was interested in knowing that kind of stuff. So instead, the next thing I did was I wrote this book, Magic in the Bible, and that examines sort of a lot of the Bible characters that we're familiar with, such as Moses, Daniel, Joseph, some of the other Old Testament people, as well as Peter and Paul. And what if you thought of their actions and beliefs as some kind of magic? Does that work? It was quite interesting. So, and I think I learned a lot about that from writing that book, and that sort of was very eye-opening. And then not too long after that, I began to realize there's also some really weird stuff where flying things are coming down out of the sky. So that is where we get into the UFOs in the Bible. And I guess that's primarily well, we can talk about any of those things if you want. And also I have another book called the Enuma Elish, which is based on the Akkadian and Sumerian mythologies, specifically just one of those mythology documents. So yeah, let's I don't know, ask me a question, I guess.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. That everything you shared is very interesting. I was wondering about your background, and particularly something that maybe didn't come up just now is what opened you or brought you into the UFO part of this thing. Have you, maybe you don't really need to tell if you don't want to, but have you had any kind of UFO experiences that sort of sparked some curiosity into this?
Yes. So I have. I almost can say that I've seen a UFO, but I didn't really see it directly. So what I saw was some lights that were basically, I saw the light shining on my wall through my bedroom window. But I don't really necessarily want to go into the whole detail about it, because honestly, it's not super interesting. But basically, there was just some lights on my wall, and the way that they moved was very strange. And so when I looked out the window, there was nothing there. And I wouldn't expect there to be anything there because there's a lake right there, and it was dark. It was nighttime, and there's nobody going to be doing running their boat at night on this lake. It's a small lake, and so it's just all lake and forest. And there's we're probably maybe 50 miles away from the nearest airport. So there was no sound at all. So anyway, the whole thing was sort of strange, and I didn't really know what to make of it, but to the best I can figure, it had to be something flying with bright lights and no noise. So that's unidentified to me. And then just in terms of other people's stories, I had been speaking with some friends who had seen like a flying disc, like your classic flying saucer UFO, quite large, come down over the city, and just the thousands of witnesses, and well, probably millions. And so I think that in order to explain that phenomenon, you know, a lot of people will basically go, oh, well, they're just crazy. Well, that doesn't make sense to me, because like people don't just normally hallucinate, right? Like, okay, if you're on acid or something, sure, maybe. But that's not the case in most of these stories. And they're just normal people who see strange things. And then beginning to realize, actually, the Bible also has similar stories where there's normal people who see strange things and they don't know what it is. So they try to explain it. And one of the best cases of that is the book of Ezekiel, which of course has been mentioned many times by lots of other authors, including Eric von Daniken and guys like that. And it comes up a lot on one of my favorite TV shows, Ancient Aliens.
Mm-hmm. Let me just ask you one thing. What made you make the connection of these unidentified phenomenon in the Bible, particularly with, well, maybe this is the UFOs that people are talking nowadays? Is it maybe because of reading Eric von Daniken and people like that?
Well, I mean, what makes you make the connection is that there is essentially identical stories. Like, the people are describing phenomenon and they're always the same. So you have a metallic object, which you have in the scriptures. You have often there's clouds or smoke or fire, which is sort of a classic thing. I believe there was a movie back in the 70s called Fire in the Sky, and you know, it's a popular theme in the UFO phenomenon. Is something's flying, and there's often associated with bright lights, which may or may not be described as fire or as some other technological component. But before we had electric lights, people would have called it fire because that's what they had in terms of lighting, right?
Yeah, the metaphors to describe it. So let me tell you one UFO experience I had. I don't think I've told it before on the show. So I was in a very remote place. I live here in Uruguay, and to the east there's this very, it's not desolate, but it's more less urban areas, right? Lots of nature. And there's this place called Cabo Polonio, so Polonio Cape. It's like a cape, a long piece of land that goes into the ocean, into the Atlantic. And one evening we were just stargazing, looking at the sky, and suddenly, very, very far away in the distance, we start seeing these lights, like it was like 3-4 in the morning, something like that. I think actually it was in the 25th of December. We went there for Christmas, I remember. And this light started doing like S's, going down, S, and finally kind of sinking into the ocean or hiding behind the horizon. And that was an experience that really really shocked me, because I had always been like very skeptical and wanting or asking the universe for signs, like, okay, give me like the 90-degree turn or stuff like that can kind of confirm and silence my rational mind. And it gave me something even more amazing. I've never had a disc or something very close kind of encounter, but that for me was pretty convincing, because it was several years ago. I know there's today we know more about kind of like private or government projects, like human projects of making special kinds of vehicles that fly. But this was very long ago, and again in a very remote area of a very small country, which for me it's like, okay, I can totally not discredit, but I could totally say this is not something human, because we are so remote. And for me that was a great experience.
Right.
And it
Yeah,
reminded
and that's
me
the
of,
thing is like,
it reminded me, sorry, of the experience when you told yours. It reminded me of this one because of the idea of the water also. You know, you had this lake near your house, so I was thinking, oh, maybe the thing went into the lake. Sometimes they say that there's bases inside lakes, who knows?
yeah, yeah, for sure, and that is a common theme too, especially around Lake Titicaca in Peru and Chile. There's always a lot of reported UFO activity in that area, as well as certain other hotspots with lakes in them. I believe there was a lake in Switzerland, if I recall correctly, and well, there's a whole bunch of them. I'm not really an expert on UFO sightings per se, just because there's so many other people looking into that, and I believe they're doing a good job on that. So I kind of follow it with some interest, but it's not something that I'm digging heavily into, because there are not really other people doing the stuff that I am doing, and I want to focus on that.
Yeah, and so just now you were mentioning the Ezekiel story, let's say, and this is when he was like taken, right? And I think he's the one that becomes Metatron. Is that right? So I was thinking in that light, what's like your favorite one, your favorite case that you documented on your book?
In the Bible?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's so many weird things. I think that maybe the thing that pulled it together most for me was sort of a combination of Ezekiel and Isaiah, because these are two guys that lived in around the same time period and around the same area. So they were both in Babylon around 500 BC, under the rule of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, and a couple of kings after him as well. And Daniel was also there at that time. Daniel plays prominently in my Magic in the Bible book, but Daniel doesn't really talk too much about UFOs. But Ezekiel and Isaiah both were guys who had experienced not one but multiple UFO experiences, and they also included abductions. So for both of them, it was essentially goes sort of the same story, where they saw a UFO come down, they tried to tell the story about what it looked like, and a person came out of the UFO and gave them a message, which they then wrote down, and a lot of their focus is on that message itself, which to me is actually not that interesting, because it's mostly politics and stuff like that. Like, I don't know what's going on in the politics and life and times of 500 BC, but I do know that when somebody tells me what they saw, to me that's the interesting part. So both these guys, Ezekiel and Isaiah, had these encounters, and it's very clear that there's machinery involved. It's not just like a spiritual encounter. It's not a vision. Although many times it is presented as a spiritual vision. whatever that means. And so that's sort of a way of brushing it off in a way. Whereas it's like, okay, well, something's actually happening, like for real. So what is it? So when they start talking about the shape and how the things move and the various phenomenon around it, such as the lights and sounds and things like that, it's very strange, but it definitely seems mechanical. It seems metallic. It seems very noisy, so it's like some kind of machine, and it's flying. So if you have an object that's flying and you don't know what it is, then by definition, it's an unidentified flying object. So to say that it's not a UFO is completely ludicrous because it's flying and it's unidentified. Now, we try to get around that by giving it a name. Well, the names that we give it are things like cherubim and ophanim and these other Hebrew words. But the problem with that is that these Hebrew words are almost meaningless because they only show up in these couple of stories. And so some of these words appear to be technical jargon to do with this machine that they're looking at, which is very clear in the case of Isaiah in his last encounter. Isaiah is actually picked up into the object. It pulls him up into the sky and suddenly transports him like about 1,000 miles away from Babylon over to Jerusalem. And he suddenly finds himself in Jerusalem, and the object puts him down inside the temple, which is kind of strange because no one's allowed to go inside the temple except for the high priest. Yet here he is, he's in the very most sacred part of the temple. Well, he starts in that kind of outer court and he walks in. But as he's doing so, there's people all over the place who shouldn't be there. And that's part of his message, is that, these people are not respecting the temple and all that kind of stuff. So that's sort of what we tend to focus on because theologically we can make a point out of that. But really, we've got a guy who literally just got either teleported or like very, very quickly transported hundreds of miles to another city. And when he walks into the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant is there, and it's been there for about 500 years since it was built by Moses and his gang there. So it's odd because in the theology of the time of the Hebrews, they would have had a lot of religious training, and so they have all these conceptual ideas about what the cherubim is, because it's common lingo in their theology. It's part of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. They do not consider the cherubim to be angelic beings. They consider the cherubim as in this whole framework of what their religion is like. It has to do with rituals and sacrifices and communicating with God. So we now look at it with a different framework, and we put all this other stuff on top of it. But all this, the concepts about angels and stuff is misplaced. And so when Isaiah goes to the temple, he doesn't see an angel. He sees the ark. He sees a bunch of religious artifacts that are already ancient by his day. But he understands those artifacts in the concept of his religious framework. However, what he has never seen is a picture of any of these things, because they weren't allowed. In the Ten Commandments, one of the Ten Commandments says, "Do not make an image." They were explicitly forbidden by God to draw a picture or carve any kind of statue or anything of basically anything. Now, it says explicitly you're not allowed to carve an image or make a picture of anything, any living being on earth or above the earth, which is also sort of a strange thing to say, because yeah, we know there are living beings on the earth, but what are these living beings above the earth? Like, what are you talking about? So God obviously knows that there's something living above the earth, and God understands cosmology. He knows that it's not a flat Earth kind of a system, and there's not this vast expanse of whatever. He knows that the Earth is round, and he knows that there are things orbiting it with life, with living beings on them. Otherwise, why would he tell them not to draw pictures of it? So when Isaiah gets to the temple, and this is the first time that he's seen any kind of representation of what cherubim actually look like. And it's now that the penny drops for him, and he is able to go, oh, and he now puts two and two together with his first encounter. And this is the encounter in Ezekiel 1, where we read about wheels within wheels, and these living creatures with four faces and eyes all over them. Like, so the first time he sees it, he doesn't have any language to put to it. So he makes up this description, and it sounds totally crazy because he has to use words that aren't really meant to apply to whatever this thing is that he saw. He doesn't have a word for like machines or holograms or flashing lights or any kind of stuff like that. So he says things like fire and faces and eyes. But now that he has witnessed the inside of the temple, he goes, "Oh, it's cherubim." Why would he do that? Did the cherubim look like they had four faces? Not according to the way that it's described in the book of Exodus, when God tells Moses how to build the cherubim. So the cherubim are some kind of object that is basically on top of the Ark of the Covenant. We don't know what they look like. We do know that they're made of gold, or at least they involve gold. But there's no indication that they look like humanoid figures with wings. So any depictions that we see of those, that's typically what they look like.
Like the little babies with wings, right?
Yeah, or that too. So you either see the babies like with a bow and arrow, maybe, like Cupid, which is a very much of a Greek thing
Right.
that got added on, or you see the more, I guess, I don't know, less of the Greek influence, where they're male, muscular men, and they are kind of, I don't know, either standing or kneeling, facing each other with their wings across like this. That's usually what you see on top of the Ark of the Covenant. But that's very much an artist's rendition. And if you look back at the description in the book of Exodus, it doesn't really have any of those features. So it does talk about wings, but again, the word wings is not necessarily like a wing per se. It does seem to be some kind of physical feature, but it could easily be there's this discrepancy between the word wings and faces that are kind of both used in there. They might mean the same thing. It might be more like a surface or an edge. And my personal interpretation is that it was some kind of geometrical shape, like a tetrahedron. There's also good evidence for that, because the tetrahedron ended up playing a big part in some of the later Jewish mysticism. Yeah, so there you've got your angels with their wings, and that's supposedly what they look like.
How the Ark of the Covenant, I think that is kind of the idea many of us have in our minds, when like kind of the thing from Indiana Jones, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's not totally wrong. It's in terms of the size and shape of the box, those dimensions are given in Exodus, and that looks pretty accurate. But the way that those cherubim are shaped and how they're formed, I think we're taking a lot of artistic liberty. Now, keep in mind, no one has ever seen the Ark of the Covenant.
I was going to ask you about that.
In
Is that supposed to be in the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem today?
No, so it is definitely not. Now, there is much debate about what happened to it. Some people believe that it was taken to Ethiopia. The Ethiopian church claims that they actually have it still, and that may or may not be true. There's also a lot of theories around like it was stolen by the Knights Templar during the Crusades. Some people say that it traveled to France. Some people think that it ended up buried in North America. This is the Oak Island treasure.
For me,
most of those.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
For me, I'm thinking that the angels, the humanoid angels with bird wings that they are typically showing here, it feels like definitely like code for something else. Like, you know how they usually would do this, like tell a story or tell a truth but modify something in order not to reveal the whole secret. So it's like those who have eyes to see would look at the angels and understand, oh, this is more probably this other thing. But I don't think any of us knows today, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a couple of I look at a couple of bits of evidence in the book about that, and there's a couple of interesting parts here. So one, with the word ends in the suffix im, so im, right? Which we also are familiar with because of Elohim, which is generally translated erroneously as God, but Elohim does not mean God, and cherubim does not mean angels. Instead, both of those words are they both use this im suffix, which means roughly like people of. So it's like, or if we were now to talk of like the chosen ones, so it's the ones part. So when we look at that, and that im suffix actually occurs in dozens of other words, many of which are
maybe like today we would say American, Uruguayan, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And that exact use is used as well, where it refers to the Kasdim as Chaldeans. So that's a nationalistic kind of a thing. And there's a few instances where it's that. There's a few instances where it is actually like more to do with a person's I guess career path, or so they're a carpenter or whatever, things like that. But then there's also many, and possibly most of these instances with I am are actually seem to be speaking of a species or a race, and many times it's pretty clear. Usually, it's pretty clear that they're non-human, and yet with the im, it also implies that they are intelligent. So it's an intelligent species, and there are some that are said to live in the water, and there are some that said to live in the sky. So I'm doing more research into that, so that'll probably show up in a future book. But it's quite fascinating because the cherubim fit into that category. So the cherubim might just be a species that lives in the sky. However, that doesn't quite work because Moses is told to create a cherubim and put it on top of the Ark of the Covenant. So something's not quite adding up. However, if you look at the detailed instructions about how they're to build it, what you end up seeing is there's a lot of intricate work with gold and with various colored wires or threads. So purple threads, blue threads, red threads, and gold threads. Weird. Like, why is that the thing that you specify? And when you also look at the story, there's only one man whose name is Bezalel, and this is in the book of Exodus. Only one man is allowed or assigned or is, I guess, qualified to build this cherubim. And meanwhile, there's a whole bunch of other people who are there to help him with the project. It's this huge building project. They've got to build the tabernacle and all these, the poles and the fabrics and drapery and all that stuff. And all these draperies of the fabrics, because it's essentially a giant tent. So all of these fabrics are woven and embroidered by experts who are weavers and embroiderers. And yet, God tells Moses and Bezalel, you need to weave and embroider this cherubim, and it can only be done by this guy Bezalel. He's not the embroiderer. He's had some kind of special training as being the only guy who will understand how to do this. And when you taken with some of the other clues that I look at, it kind of sounds like they're either building a computer with a built-in program, so not like today's computers, but maybe the computers of 50 years ago, where they were very much kind of a hard-coded program built right into it, like what we might say as firmware today. And keep in mind, I actually know what I'm talking about. I've built computers that way. I have a computer engineering background, and it totally works. You can build a computer using just thread, especially if you use different kinds of threads, and especially if you consider different types of conductivity. So gold has a very high conductivity, and these other threads, whatever they are, would be probably lower conductivity, so they could act as your resistors and capacitors and things like that, which is really all you need to build a computer. All you need is 3 parts, wires, capacitors, and resistors.
That's really interesting. Like, do you think these threads? So I was thinking maybe as you were speaking that they would be like I was getting the feeling of something like electric. You know how the angels are, the cherubim are put or are shown in these pictures, at least with like their wings close to each other. So it feels like something could be electrically passed from one to the other and kind of making some sort of circuit. But then you're speaking about these different threads. It's not cloth. It's definitely some kind of mineral. I wonder because of the different colors, which are very, very kind of strange for minerals, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And there's a bunch of other clues regarding that mineral topic, some of which I go into, but they're a little bit difficult to apply to the thread, because it's not, the thread thing is really not clear. But I believe that is because we are only really given certain details. The part that we're reading about how to build this is the executive summary, and only Bezalel has the exact detailed instructions. So, but having said that, sapphire, the word sapphire is used many times in the book of Exodus and elsewhere. And often it is, in some cases, it seems to be a data storage type of technology. And in some cases, it almost sounds like a pic. If you can bring up that picture of Princess Leia and R2-D2 from the very first Star Wars movie, where she says, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're our only hope."
Let me see
if you can find that.
Yeah, I'm trying to share the screen. What am I?
Mhm.
What are you seeing anything? I just let
Yeah,
me stop my
yeah,
share
I
because
see your screen.
I don't know what I'm sharing. Just a
Oh,
second.
okay.
Uh, Here we go. I'm in the Ark of the Covenant, right?
Oh yeah, there.
Yeah. Leia
Yep, that's
and
right.
R2D2, right? Let me see.
Yeah, yeah. Let's see if that comes up. Yeah, there you go. So right there. Where is he?
Which one
Maybe try
represents
help
the?
me Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah. Let's see.
Yeah, there you go. So you
Oh
see
yeah, when
how
they're talking to the hologram, yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So R2D2 has been programmed by Princess Leia with a message, which he
Right.
basically recorded her video and audio, and then he plays it back, and it has this blue tone, very much like sapphire.
Mm.
And so you got to wonder if George Lucas knew something that he wasn't telling us about these ancient mythologies. And to be honest, I kind of think that most sci-fi authors do this, whether it's intentional or not, and they might know something, or they may have these ideas somehow subconsciously implanted into their minds by aliens. Like it seems crazy, but how are these same topics always coming up, right?
Yeah, and
So
reality
for this,
seems to be kind of like reality seems to share the answers through art, even if the artists don't know what they're sharing. For those who have the eyes to see.
yes, exactly. And now that we see it here with C3PO watching, doesn't C3PO kind of look a
Mm.
little bit like a cherubim?
Yeah, and he's gold, so
I
there's
mean,
the gold thread. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I'm pretty sure everything.
yeah,
One of the like the big hypothesis or whatever that I or working hypothesis that I go in the through the world using is this idea of that everything is life is a dream and everything is a symbol. So from our day-to-day interactions with people to this to art, and also, for example, earlier before we started, I looked up your name because immediately when you wrote to me, like your last name caught my attention because it kind of sounds like you are the protector of God, Goudsward, right? So then I looked up
right,
your name. It's Kenneth, right? It's the full name,
yeah,
and it's
yeah,
I think it's like the fireborn or something like that. So you're kind of the fireborn protector of God, and that made me think of what's the angel? Is it Gabriel with the sword outside the garden? That made me think kind
right.
of that image. So your name is kind of very significant, and my own name is Raphael, like the archangel. And so
Oh yeah,
maybe you want to continue on this thread of the threads of the Ark of the Covenant, but eventually I think it would be cool if we could. I have a question about the archangel Raphael because there's a story about him in the Bible, and maybe we could talk a little bit about that in a few minutes.
sure, absolutely. I actually don't really have a lot more to say about the threads, but I do want to say a couple things about this hologram idea. So when the idea of a hologram isn't just because it's blue. There are a couple of other stories relating to the some are relating to the Ark of the Covenant, and some are actually taking place inside a UFO on top of Mount Sinai. So the first off, first let's look at this Mount Sinai thing. So when um, when when Moses goes up Mount Sinai to get the Ten Commandments, we're always told this story in a very straightforward way. Here's Moses. He goes up the mountain. He gets the stones. He comes down. He gives it to the people. That's totally not what happened. Moses went up and down the mountain 7 times, and Moses was not the only one to go up the mountain. In fact, if you look at Exodus 14, you will probably find the absolute most buried fact from the Bible that no one is talking about. And because we have this theological concept that no one can look upon God and live, because God is so holy that to gaze upon him will kill you. Well, that's not what the Bible says. If you read Exodus chapter 14, Moses goes up the mountain, but God also tells him, hey, don't come up alone this time. Bring your friend Joshua, bring your brother Aaron, bring your nephews Nadab and Abihu, and also bring 70 other guys. You go pick them. And so they already had 70 guys. They're like the elders or whatever. But so there's like 76 people. They all go up. They're on top of Mount Sinai, and they are, the description is very strange. They are in a room, which is first of all weird because there's not a room on top of a mountain, is there? And they're looking at the floor, which again is weird. And they really notice that the floor looks amazing. It's so beautiful, and it's blue like sapphire, and it's clear like the sky, which is again really weird and kind of starts to sound a bit holographic. And then they all these 76 people are, it sounds to me like they're on board some kind of spaceship, and they are now brought a feast. They sit down at these presumably at long tables, and they have a feast with the Elohim. So not only is it not Yahweh that's talking to them the whole time, it's actually these Elohim. There are multiple of them. It doesn't say how many Elohim there were, but there were 70 humans or 76 humans. So there could have just as easily been, maybe that number was picked to match. So maybe they were sitting across from each other, 76 humans, 76 Elohim. We don't know. But what we do know is that the humans were eating with the Elohim and meeting face to face. So that's literally what it says in there. It also says, then they saw a throne with Yahweh sitting on it. And it goes on to describe how it's blue, and I go into like the actual Hebrew words. So if you want to hear more about that, you really do need to read my book, because I think that the Hebrew words themselves are pretty clear. It's just that we've been misinterpreting a lot. So it ends up sounding a lot like these guys, including Moses and all these elders, are in a spaceship. And the spaceship has some holographic projections. And one of the uses for that is to allow Yahweh to attend the meeting via Zoom. And so that's what he does, is he's there with telepresence, where the rest of them are face to face with the Elohim. It sounds like before Yahweh appears on screen, the screen is defaulting to a screensaver that has a accurate representation of the Earth floating in space, and with the orbits of the planets and things like that. So basically, they're talking about an accurate representation of the cosmos. Whether that's on a galactic scale or a solar scale, it's not clear, but it seems pretty definite that it's some kind of navigational tool, and that also telepresence. Yeah, so maybe let's move on. So you had a question
Sure.
about
yeah, and
Raphael?
let me say something about this, add something to what you were just saying. It's very interesting. We were also talking about before how it's really confusing, the terms and the definitions of some terms, and even the images that have come down through time about these different terms in for example, the Bible, but in many different scriptures in different traditions. It's definitely some kind of telephone game has happened through time, and so
Yeah,
it feels sometimes like it's, I don't know if I would say that like it's confusing on purpose, but maybe through, I understand the Bible is kind of like a compilation of different books, and maybe there's parts where they are talking about, it feels like sometimes they're talking about something more etheric, more spiritual or astral, and sometimes when they are talking about the same, using the same term, they're talking about something more material, more physical, even kind of mechanical maybe, or technological in sometimes, and sometimes even something physical that is very different from humans, or kind of some kind of, so it's like sometimes they're talking about like higher beings, but sometimes it feels like they're talking about aliens in a more animal kind of way, or creature, humanoid, something kind of way. So sometimes Yahweh feels, and I know these Gnostic ideas that kind of flip the whole story on its head, and Yahweh is interchanged with a snake and etc. So it's like sometimes they say Yahweh and they mean what we would say maybe in Hinduism, Brahman, or the ultimate reality, but sometimes it's even through its actions, it feels kind of like a bad guy. It's very confusing.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely, that's true. And part of that is because we tend to translate several words into the one word God, which is very not helping. It's not a good idea. And there are probably several different reasons for that. I think it's pretty well known that at some point the Jews believed that saying the word Yahweh was disrespectful, and so they began to just say the Lord. But even then, they still wrote Yahweh. So it gets very confusing because if you're reading the Bible in English, sometimes you'll see God, sometimes you'll see the Lord. And usually if it says the Lord, it's actually Yahweh. And a lot of the times if it says God, it's, well, you never know. It might be Yahweh, but it might be the Elohim. There are numerous cases throughout the Bible where you'll find a phrase like this. It'll say Yahweh of the Elohim. However, they never translate it that way. So what you'll get there is the Lord our God.
Right.
But that's a very different interpretation. And so the concept.
Do you know about this book, the Book of Urantia?
I've heard of it. I haven't really spent very much time.
It's a trip, and it's very long. I of course haven't read it all, but I kind of got the gist of the thing, and it gives this kind of Star Wars sci-fi perspective on stories, or kind of allusions to stories and circumstances from the Bible. And yeah, it feels like the Bible sometimes refers to what the Urantia books talk about, kind of like organization of like kind of sometimes even kind of military organizations or government kind of things, like you were saying, sitting in the table with the 76 humans and the 76 who knows what, Elohim or whatever, and one of them that feels kind of like the boss coming through a hologram. And it also makes me think of the idea of the Anunnaki. Like maybe it's sometimes the Bible is talking, or the Elohim maybe are sometimes the Anunnaki, maybe sometimes, and then there's the Nephilim, which I'm kind of confused about. I think they're giants, but they are the sons of the Elohim with the human women or whatever. It's very, very confusing.
Yeah, it is. So actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because the Nephilim is actually a huge part of this story, even though it's only mentioned in one verse in the Bible. This is in Genesis 6 or Genesis 4. I forget. I think it's 6. In Genesis 6, there's literally one verse. It says, the sons of God came to earth, and they had sex with the daughters of men. They saw that they were beautiful, so they mated with them, and they had children that were the Nephilim, the mighty men of old. Then it moves on. It moves into the story of Noah and the ark. But that's a very strange thing to do, because you're not going to bring that up and say, hey, remember those mighty men of old? You guys know what I'm talking about. Well, that's what he's assuming, is the writer of that story assumes that we do know what he's talking about, and we know what he means by these mighty men of old. So he's calling them the Nephilim, which that's the only time that this word occurs in the Bible, and it doesn't really seem to occur in any other literature as well, although the story is told in other literature, specifically the Book of Enoch. But in the Book of Enoch, they don't use the word Nephilim. They instead are talking about the Watchers. So in this, in the Enoch story, you have the Watchers are the excuse me, the Watchers come to Earth and they sleep with these women and they create this other group of people. So obviously the two stories are the same, but they're like this, right? So it's like, this is the Watchers, this is the Nephilim, and then this is, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Maybe that analogy.
No, because it is definitely very confusing. Sometimes to kind of get a kind of image that I'm not very good at expressing yet, what I kind of do is sort of make correlations to other myths from other cultures. So maybe the Titans from the Greek culture, and you have the Titans, you also have the gods of Olympus. So kind of maybe Yahweh could kind of sometimes be correlated to Zeus, but sometimes could be correlated to whatever came before, or I think Saturn is before, and or Uranus with Gaia, and it's like so confusing. And that also correlates, you know, you have that book on the Enigma Elish. It also correlates to stuff from the Sumerians, right? And in fact, the Sumerian stories come before what's written in the Bible. Is that correct? Or it's written
Absolutely.
before?
So this,
yeah.
Well, yeah. So the Sumerian stories are from Sumer, and the Sumerian culture, which was several thousand years before the Hebrew culture arose, and again another 1,000 years before the Greeks. So all these stories that we read are kind of all go back to the Sumerian in terms of where they're getting these ideas. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Sumerian were the first, because there's also things that tie in with the Indian subcontinent, with the Bhagavad Gita and the Vedic texts, as well as things in South America and even North America. And I'm becoming quite convinced that there were ancient trade routes and possibly a global civilization up to at least 10,000 years ago, if not further back. So all of these things are almost certainly related, and there's all kinds of clues, whether you're a linguist or an archaeologist. All these different fields are seeing the same types of things pop up.
Yeah.
We're actually, I keep seeing stories now lately about how they're finding ancient Chinese artifacts in Eastern America, North America, like in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and places like this, where why is there a 5,000-year-old Mongolian sword here? Like, what's going on? And nobody can explain that stuff. But I think there's linguistic clues as well, which is another project I'm working on, relating to the Proto-Indo-European kind of thesis there.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah, it really is. And so what we think we know is so limited and so perversely distorted, and yet we think, oh well, that's what we know, but it's only a very tiny piece, and a lot of it's wrong. So so your name is based on Raphael, which means what?
Raphael, I think, is one of let's say the translations I found, or the idea at least of the meaning of the name is like the healing of God. So kind of Raphael kind of represents the power of healing from God. I guess the L particle in the name is referred to God, which I mean it kind of connects with the idea Elohim. It has the L also.
Yeah.
So Raphael is
Yeah.
the healing of God is kind of the idea that I've gotten. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. So I know that Raphael is sort of the hero of the Book of Enoch, because in that story, what happens is the Watchers come down, they mate with these women, and they give birth to the Nephilim. It's not completely clear whether they're literally giants or if they're, there's something strange about them anyway. But it seems that there is some kind of genetic manipulation and mutation happening, which somehow pissed off the guy who's in charge. Now, why would that be? I believe that it's because God was already doing some kind of genetic experiment, and these guys messed up his experiment, and he had to start over, which is why the flood. So he's like, okay, nope, we start over, throw away all this, smash the beakers. We're going to start over, and that is pretty clear in the stories of the Bible. I talk a little bit about that as well in a section about Noah and some of the Hebrew words around that, which really strongly seem to indicate that. But the book of Exodus gives us a little bit more of that same story, because what it says is that when these Nephilim began to increase in number, so there's kind of a little bit more of a time frame in there where the Bible just jumps directly to Noah. And the book of Enoch says that these Nephilim were here doing this stuff, and it wasn't good, and so something had to be done. So in this story, Raphael and some of his crew basically come to Earth from somewhere else, and they basically, they heal the Earth by wiping out these Nephilim. Yet somehow it wasn't quite good enough, because we still had the flood. But it's more complicated than just the story that we're hearing. And so maybe that's one of the reasons why they threw the Book of Enoch into the garbage can and said, no, it's not going to be allowed in part of the Bible. Depending on where you live, it may or may not be considered Bible.
So they do a first kind of wipe, or a first kind of cleanse, and then it some remnants are still there. Yeah.
So now here's where Gabriel enters the story, and this gets really fucking weird. Okay, so what happens now is there's a series of about let's see if I can find how many.
And meanwhile, let me ask you if you know. Do you know, as far as timeline, this book? Because where I've known about Raphael is the only place I found him is in the book of Tobit, I think is his name. Tobit and his son Tobias. Do you know where in the timeline these guys are? Is this after the flood or before the flood?
My understanding is that it's immediately before the flood. It could be a span of a few years or a few decades. I don't know. I would need to research that some more.
Right.
And I have not read Tobit, and I've read Enoch, but that's one of the things that I'm still digging into more. But okay, so regarding this idea of the DNA experiment, or the biological experimentation, we have, before the flood, we have kind of several things happening. Step one, there's Adam. Then not much longer, then this whole Nephilim thing goes down, and Raphael is sent in to clean up the mess. In that same time period, there's Enoch, and and then Enoch is actually Noah's grandfather, or great grandfather. Anyway, so just a few generations, so a couple hundred years, and there's a lot of very interesting things happening. So if you believe the book of Enoch, it's supposedly that is when that all took place. So it's before the flood, but not like a long time before. And then after the flood, you get the same type of DNA manipulation happening. However, they're more discreet about it, I suppose you could say. So instead, you don't have stories about people coming down and having sex with people and creating new beasts. Instead, what you have is stories about an angel shows up and proclaims to some woman that she's going to be pregnant, which is kind of strange. And it's even stranger when you realize that every time one of these angels shows up, it's a guy named Gabriel. So is this guy Gabriel, is his entire job just telling women that they're going to get pregnant? Or is he somehow like the stud and is sent to actually make these DNA manipulations happen through biological means, if you know what I mean? So maybe Gabriel is the father of, let's see here, Samson. There's good evidence that Samson's mother was impregnated by some kind of extraterrestrial. Then it happens again with Sarai, who is Abraham's wife. And then it also happens with Elizabeth, who is the mother of John the Baptist, and also with Mary, the mother of Jesus. So it's sort of leads you to wonder if Samson, Jacob and Isaac, and John the Baptist and Jesus are all half brothers, sharing the same father, whose name is Gabriel. Like, that's not what the Bible is saying, but it sort of seems like what the Bible is not saying. And either way, it's a very strange idea. So
you know what it seems like to me?
It also
like there's this idea of the different eras, the different epochs, like in the Hindu cosmology, the yugas, right, or the golden age, silver, bronze, etc. It feels to me like during these more, let's call them ancient times, the veil between the physical world and the spiritual world, let's say, was thinner, or it was more like one thing. Matter and energy were like more one thing. So today we look at that past and we kind of use the like one the one kind of perspective that we have, which is more the material perspective, and we kind of project that into the past and think, okay, if the world today is at least to our perception, if the world is more material or something like that, we kind of project our modern mentality and think that the world has always been this way. And I'm thinking that perhaps the reason why it's confusing to understand that is because several things or several different aspects of reality are happening in simultaneous. And so there's, on the one hand, something very physical happening back then, which could then point to the idea of the Anunnaki, or the more kind of UFO, nuts and bolts, as they call it, the alien hypothesis. But at the same time, something more spiritual is happening. Maybe you could say through the material events in time, something spiritual is happening also. And so a single story is describing many different levels of events that are happening, I think.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I'm like, even after 50 years of attempting to be a very spiritual person, I don't know what spiritual means. And like, I don't get it, but I also do sometimes get it. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, maybe that's what Jesus meant when he was constantly saying, "The kingdom of heaven is at hand," and that's kind of that was his mantra, if anything. Um, that was really the thing that he said absolutely the most of. Like, if you were to count all the things that Jesus said, that is definitely his number one quote in terms of times that he said it.
Like sometimes
And
today we speak about interdimensional entities, right? It's kind of an idea that's
yeah,
very popular these days. And we kind of differentiate that from more the physical aliens, for example. And then there could even be something even more subtle and more subtle. And I'm thinking that maybe or for me, it's quite likely that the more subtle things kind of manifest in the physical, and so maybe through subtle means they do something, they perform an action, let's say, and it has a spiritual or a subtle effect. And at the same time, them doing this in the astral, let's say, also implies that something kind of is brought into form, into shape in the material side, which kind of has a kind of life of its own. You know, it's like a projection. You know how this idea of four-dimensional and third-dimensional, and how and two-dimensional, like the square, the cube, and the hypercube. So the hypercube can like
right.
move in a particular way and have a certain effect on reality, but at the same time, its projection in this third dimension, the cube, is also moving and having a particular effect, which might be apparently different from that one, because it's like the shadow of the effect of the higher dimension thing. You know what I mean? It's kind of confusing to say, but
Yeah, well, it is. But I think you're right, and maybe that's why we see that art and life imitate each other,
yeah,
because they're both stemming from some idea that's on some other realm, I guess, or whatever. And yeah, in terms of how that works, well, who knows? But like, I think there's definitely some good indications that there's some kind of akashic plane, or there's something that's maybe it's just information based,
yeah,
which then of course gets us into simulation theory. And if everything is simulated, then what hardware is it running on? Or is it also running inside a simulation? And if it is, then how many simulations deep is it? And how many times has that simulation been run? How many instantiations of that have there been? And maybe that's what the ancients were hinting at, and probably because they only understood a hint of it, was like you mentioned, these different epochs, and that shows up in all different kinds of cultures. It's definitely strongly within the Hindu culture, as well as the Egyptian culture, with Zep Tepi, the earlier times, and very strongly in the Aztec traditions, as well as really many of the First Nations communities in North America have similar beliefs, although they're probably less publicized. But yeah, there's all these cultures all over the world that have these similar ideas. So one of them is this cyclical nature, but also another one is that the gods, or whoever, somebody came from the sky. So I think with that, we have to at least give some credit there that they might know what they're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. And that idea of like the gods walking among the humans or something like that, like also tying it up with something you brought up before, that idea of a common worldwide civilization before the flood, which it's totally where I'm going with my own investigations and with my own. I work very much through intuition and like things that resonate, and that definitely looks like the case for me. And even looking into stuff like from I think it's from theosophy, you know, the ideas that they did this kind of Akashic records readings of the past, and or kind of remote viewings of the past, and saw how Atlantis was as a civilization, and even before Lemuria. And then there's also the idea of Hyperborea, and you start going down this rabbit hole, and it seems like all the things that a few years ago were like totally impossible, they start making more and more sense every day. The hollow earth, the yeah, even this idea of having like different like what's this called, like different steps of a kind of spiritual hierarchy from maybe from the more material to the more subtle or etheric or whatever, and having different kinds of, eventually you have the humans, and then eventually you start having things that, for lack of better words, we call gods, maybe with a small g, and maybe we call it in plural. But then you have, and even in you mentioned India, there you have gods that are very much correlated to the Greek gods. But at the same time, you have like quote unquote the bad guys, which are the asuras, and so you have this thing too. But then you also have like above that you have Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, the creator, sustainer, and destroyer. And even above, this is quote unquote above or behind. Above or behind that, you have Atman, which is the individual soul, and you have Brahman, which is the everything that is. And in the end, the common thread across all of that is the I am, right? Is that everything, all of that is who we actually are. And we are like, maybe across that thread, our point of focus and our point of attention is like sitting on one part of this thread, you know, and so we identify with that part. So right now, our focus is sitting on the human part of this spectrum, and in particular, in my case, it's sitting in where whatever this body and this person and this mind is like individualized. Yours is in yours, right? And so right now we think, oh, I am this body, I am this mind, these memories. But when we go more into the silence and even when we have these supernatural experiences, it's kind of like that focus is kind of shaken a little bit, and we are able to kind of expand it a little and see a bit more, like our identity horizon kind of expands, and we start seeing, oh, there's something more, and I am that. And so once you expand it a little bit, if you really look at what it implies, it means that you are everything. Because if you could expand your awareness a little, you could expand it infinitely. Therefore, you are that infinite thing. And I kind of went into some kind of tangent, but this conversation and what you were just saying inspired me to share it in that way. I don't know if you have some comments about that.
Well, no, that's actually really cool, and I have something to add to that I think is pretty unique, and that is sort of, I'm going to take that. I totally agree with what you're saying in terms of these levels of consciousness that sort of emerge out of a combining of underlying layers, if you will. And I think that's what you're getting at with the concept of the Atman and the Brahman, because if I am me and you are you and we are we, then what is that collection? And does that, if I understand who I am and you understand who you are, then shouldn't we understand who we are? And isn't there some kind of consciousness at that level that I'm not aware of and you are slightly aware of because you feel it? but we can't necessarily get a really strong connection to it sometimes. But I think that seems to make sense, and especially when you look at what. So let's drill down to the lower levels. So I am me, okay, but am I really me? No, I'm not me. I'm a huge collection of cells, and each cell is me on a different level. But I'm not aware of those me's, and those guys are not aware of me. Now, if you look at every animal cell, not just for humans, but every animal, and maybe plants too. I'm not super familiar with that side of how that works. But if you look at the way that cells are built, cells have other things inside of them that we're not really allowed to talk about because we give them weird scientific names and just say, oh, this is a chromosome and this is something, and we make up shit so that it sounds technical.
Yeah, like we understand it because we gave it a name. Yeah.
Yeah. So inside every cell of yours and mine, there are 23 chromosomes. Now, what that is 23 little chunks of separate matter that is made out of DNA, and those DNA are different from each other. Those are not human DNA. Those are 23 different species of DNA inside every one of your cells. And one of the best examples of this is, and this is where science is actually coming out and saying it amazingly, is that the mitochondria, which is a part of every cell, has its very own DNA, and the mitochondrial DNA does not even get passed through sexual reproduction. So all the mitochondrial DNA that you have, you inherited it from your mother, and none of it comes from your father. So already we see a different type of reproduction happening in our own body, and it's a non-sexual reproduction that's happening in a species inside our body called mitochondria that is a non-human DNA. That DNA has nothing to do with any of the genetics that we find ourselves that play into our attributes and things. Many of these other chromosomes have more interplay, but my proposal is that, yeah, they all kind of interfere with each other, and they're able to do so. And what we see and what we think is a human is actually a combination of a whole bunch of different DNA effects from 23 different species. And in each of those species, they have also taken over DNA from other species before them. And so there's all this mixing and matching where DNA is getting basically swallowed up and turned into and not taken into another gene or another chromosome, I guess, technically. And sometimes they actually swap. So there's a lot of really weird stuff going on at the cellular level, which makes you really wonder, what is a species even a concept that makes any sense? And is a human a concept that makes any sense? And am I just a collection of intelligent cells, or is a cell maybe not even the intelligent being? Maybe it's each of those chunks of chromosomes that are where the intelligence is. We don't know. We have not been able to determine where sentience rises. At one point in the early days of biology, and like probably about 100 years ago, when neuroscience was a brand new thing, the idea was, oh, we now understand how the brain works, and we will very shortly be able to figure out how everything, like how we think. Yeah, well, it doesn't work that way, and we never figured it out. And now the neurologists and neuroscientists are like, well, it has something to do with this, but this isn't the whole story. It's not like the mind and the brain are not synonymous. And in fact, there seems to be good indication now for some of these other more ancient models that you see in traditional Chinese medicine and in other places, where there are concepts of the mind being resident in other organs within the body or distributed throughout the body, possibly in like a whole networked thing that we can't even really talk about because we don't even know. We haven't discovered it yet, though they do talk about it in the ancient Chinese literature, with talking about things like systems of meridians and qi and concepts like that, which also is also in the ancient Indian literature as well. So yeah, like who are we? Who am I? Who are all these little tiny guys inside my finger? We don't know. And so if I think that I'm me, then do they also think that they're they? And does this also think this is this? So we just don't know because we can only see this one layer that we're on.
And at the same time, how I want to say a few things about what you talked. But the first thing is like how at the same time language itself is such a limited, though incredible tool. It's very limited, and you say like even the question we present, we say, "Am I me?" What do those "Am I me?" What do those three words even mean, right? In right. Connection with each other, what do you mean by I, and what do you mean by me? They seem to be two things that you are implicitly or subconsciously we're expressing them as okay. They seem to be two different things. Am I this thing that I call me? So clearly, if I am I and I call this other thing me, it's an other. So I am not that. But in the day-to-day, I am generally identified with this me, with what now, when I am asking the question, kind of the I arises, and I start wandering through the I and looking at, so it's like you have maybe, my model is kind of like the higher self is looking at the mind and at the body from like outside time. And so when you say I, sometimes, not every time, but sometimes when we're saying I and making this auto-reflection, we're talking from the higher self. And when we say me, we are talking about the body and the person. So that's very confusing also, language itself. Then I had this question came up about the mitochondria. I was thinking, I understand mitochondria is very connected to the energy of the cells, the energy production of the cells. So I wonder if other animals also have mitochondria. I'm not aware of that. I don't know if you know that.
Yeah, they do.
Okay, so it's kind of, yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about, how we have this.
So right. So here's my theory about that. Now, having said that, I'm not a biologist. But then again, I'm also not a epidemiologist, which everyone else seems to be nowadays. But having said that, we all have our opinions. So here's a couple of ideas on that. Is that well, okay. I'm going to say some crazy shit that I haven't really worked out.
Yeah, we're here for that. So, I love this.
So what if when the gods came to Earth, they were in some kind of pre-animal form? So what if the animal is what, maybe the Nephilim were the first animal. Maybe before the Nephilim, there were only something else, maybe plants, or maybe some other, I mean, there's other things that are neither plant nor animal. There's like bacteria and stuff like that, and all kinds of different things. Yeah, so what happens if I think that there's a parallel between animals and mitochondria, and also it has something to do with the outside exoskeleton of the cell wall. So I'll probably get a few details wrong, whatever. So basically, at some point, something happened, and all of a sudden, instead of plants with hard walls, now there's these new things that have different soft walls, and they've basically eaten these mitochondria and forced them to become slaves for them. And they're now in captivity, and they work for us. Well, that actually strongly parallels some of the narrative elements in the Sumerian myths, where Enki and Enlil are supposedly creating man to be the slaves. So maybe that's the creation of animals, and maybe the gods themselves are plants, or maybe amoebas or something else. Now, there's actually pretty good evidence along the plant line when you look at the Norse theology and the etymological tie-ins with Norse words, and especially with the runic alphabet, because a lot of these the actual letters, which are the kind of the fundamental chunks of information in runic, correspond to concepts regarding the early Norse gods, and things like life force and energy, and oddly, trees. So the words in English, we have two words for different trees. Hardwoods. One of the most popular forms of hardwood tree is an oak, a mighty oak, and another is the ash. This is another type of hardwood tree. Both of those words are actually descended from the same Nordic word in Norse mythology, which is tied to a specific runic letter, and which is basically, I guess, meant to symbolize a tree. But in that language, that word means God. It's the same word for tree and God. So what's going on there? And there's just all these weird clues like that, where it's like, oh, well, it's a coincidence. Yeah, but it's super weird. So I don't know.
It's very interesting how, yeah,
there's a lot of strange things.
All the pagan beliefs, or the so-called pagan beliefs, they are very, very much nature oriented, and they are generally connected to the earth and to the plants particularly.
And even though, right, and even though we have like hacked away at all of these beliefs, they're still there, because in the book in the book of Genesis in the Bible, there's still a story about the two trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is a super weird story, and I'm still not really clear on how to interpret it. I started writing a book about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and so far I'm up to I believe it was somewhere around 50 different interpretations of ways that I can take it. So it's going to be a really thick book, and I don't know if it's going to make any sense at all, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, and so you were saying before then the thing about the mitochondria that piqued my interest in regards to if we were the only creature with mitochondria, but I thought like animals need lots of energy, so they must have at least something similar. And there was something else back there about the DNA. Oh yeah, also again it's similar to the thing about language, but in this case it's the question of our models of reality. We keep forgetting that, we start talking about, especially when we talk about things that are so hard to grasp, like microscopic things and even smaller, we tend to just because we call it the chromosome, we think we know what it is, we know everything about it, or we know that it even exists, when it's it's kind of a dress that we kind of put over something, or a kind of net that we throw over reality, and then we kind of forget that we threw a net and look at the things that are caught in its holes as things in themselves, rather than interpretations or descriptions of something that used to be, let's say, outside the net, and that was one thing which the net has kind of divided into different things, and we kind of forget about that. So like, and that's what's behind science, this evolution of understanding and of concepts and of theories. One day we think things work one way, eventually we understand it works totally different, or we make a little tweak here, a little tweak there, and understand it better. But still, they are descriptions, and the biggest phrase that I always remember for this is the map is not the terrain.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually a very important concept about models, and that's one of my guiding principles is that a model is always not the thing. And I used to do a lot of model train stuff, and you would have a very detailed HO scale model train, and they based this model by taking measurements of this locomotive and made sure that they matched the color of the paint and all this stuff. So it's very realistic in terms of you can look at it and maybe not even know that it's not real. A lot of these guys have put so much detail into their scenes, but
it won't take you anywhere.
So in terms of, sorry, I missed that.
But it won't take you anywhere, that train.
Yeah, exactly. You can try to get on the train, you're not going to fit. So it's a really terrible model, but also it's a really great model because it looks like it. So it depends on what you're trying to do with it. So I think that everything that we do is really a model. And if you look at chemistry, we've come a long way in the field of chemistry in the last few hundred years. But chemistry works on a specific layer. If you go down a layer, you can talk about the physics of what's happening inside each atom. If you go down a layer again, you get into quantum physics and stuff like that. And there's probably other stuff in between that we haven't even discovered yet. But if you go up into biology, there's maybe several steps up between chemistry and biology. There's a lot going on that we have some understanding of, but a very limited amount. And I think that it just as proof of how little we know, let's look at the word chromosome that you mentioned. So here's how little we know about chromosome. The word chromosome is a Greek word, and all it means is this is the thing that changes color. That's the stupidest name. Why is it called that? Well, because when they discovered chromosomes, back whenever it was, about 100 years ago, they basically had they were in a science lab with a little dish of some genetic material, and they put some dye into the dish, and there were little chunks that changed color, and some stuff did nothing. That's a chromosome. It's that chunk that changed color that we learned 100 years ago. It has nothing to do with what it does or how it works or why it's there. We still have no idea really what's going on. We know a little bit more now. We understand that chromosomes are made of genes, or not even, that's not even technically correct to say. They're not made out of genes. It's kind of like saying a book is a chromosome. It's a chunk of thing, it's a matter, and a gene is a page. And so the gene, if you have a book, you look at it and you're like, okay, there's a gene right there. Oh, well, some genes we can understand, and some genes seem to be written in a different language, or some genes are mostly blank. And that's still where we're at with chromosomes. Is it's all DNA. It's in DNA in this case would be the the letters, so, and the words, I suppose. So we have letters, we have words, we have pages, we have books. A chromosome is a book, and then there's all this stuff in between where we all we really know is, well, this book has letters in it. Do you know what the story is? No. Do you know how to read this book? No. Do you know what language it is? No. But I know there's letters, so I totally understand this book, and that's almost where we're at. It's not quite that bad.
Yeah, maybe even, could you imagine the language of the letters that we don't understand? Maybe they actually say the whole other section of the book is false, or it should not be interpreted in a particular way.
Yeah, or maybe they say you're reading the wrong book. Go to this library.
Yeah, well,
we have so much to learn.
Yeah, and so much to unlearn as well. So Ken, Goudsward, this has been a great conversation. I like it when these conversations start going like off the rails and they start going more towards our intuition and whatever comes up in the dynamic between the guest and myself. I think they are the most interesting thing, and this was very much lots of fun. I am really happy to have met you, to have had this conversation, and I hope we can do it again very soon. Would you like to share some links to where people can find your books, to your website, to your social media?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I wish I had well, maybe I'll just send you a URL you can put on.
Yeah, I'll have all the links on the description.
Okay, so dimensionfold.com is my main site. It's a publishing company as my business, so you'll see stuff in there to other books and whatever, but you can definitely find me there. If you want to go directly to my UFO book, go ufo.dimensionfold.com. And then you'll also see on that site, there's also going to be a link to my YouTube page, and a bunch of my other stuff that I've got there.
Very good, great. And I also want to remind the audience that I have a Patreon. I am welcoming everybody to join there and start creating community around this amazing off-the-cusp and interesting conversations and topics, to see if we can kind of make a little bit more sense of everything we're talking about. I also share there's exclusive episodes there. There's some of my music, some sound healing and stuff like that. And I really appreciate people for being there, for following this. It's already been like 50-something episodes, and I'm really, really happy and enjoying learning about the work that goes behind this, and especially well, I'm an Aquarius, so I like devour ideas. I love thinking about a million different things, but I'm also learning so much and growing in my heart, through meeting people like yourself and the other guests who are also in this kind of quest of, maybe we're trying to understand things. We're in the end, I think what we're trying to do is to understand ourselves. And we're starting out there a little bit, even though we of course do our inner work, but we know that there's something that we can learn through looking at the outside. And recently in a psychedelic journey I had, from the journey, I got this kind of visual, or this idea, this image, that we're looking outside for the answers, and everything that we look at is actually an arrow pointing back at us, but we keep dissecting the arrow and looking at, oh, it's green and it has lights and it's a straight arrow, but we are missing the whole point, which is that all the arrows are pointing back at ourselves. And I think we kind of touched on that with this conversation. This part we talked about the I am, and that thread that connects everything. So yeah, I'm really thankful that you helped me get to put some words onto those ideas. And yeah, again, thank you so much for being here. Let's do it again.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
All right.